Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into a world that's probably a lot less glamorous than those swashbuckling pirate movies make it out to be. Imagine, if you will, the gentle rocking of a ship, not on a cruise, but as a perpetual, stomach-churning reality. The air is thick with the smell of tar, sweat, and something indefinably rotten, a symphony of creaking timbers and distant shouts echoing through the darkness. You feel the rough, unyielding deck beneath your bare feet, the chill seeping into your bones even through the threadbare clothes you woke up in. This isn't a dream. It's your new nightmare, a life you never chose, thrust upon you with the blunt force of a press gang's cudgel. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least we can enjoy the thought of it from the comfort of our homes, right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stumbling, disoriented, the ringing in your ears slowly fading to reveal the cacophony of a bustling port. One moment you were enjoying a pint, or perhaps just minding your own business, and the next, a heavy blow to the head brought your world crashing down. When you finally regain some semblance of awareness, you find yourself not in your familiar bed, but crammed into a boat, jostling alongside other bewildered, angry faces. This, my friend, is your rude introduction to Lord Nelson's Royal Navy. There's no polite invitation, no job interview, just a brutal, undeniable reality. You've been pressed. Impressment, the forceful recruitment of men into naval service, was a cornerstone of maintaining Britain's massive fleet, especially during times of war. It was legal, brutal, and utterly devastating for those snatched from their lives. You might have been a baker, a farmer, a tailor, it doesn't matter now. Your previous life, your family, your dreams, all instantly evaporate. Historians still argue whether impressment was a necessary evil for national security or a fundamental violation of human rights that crippled countless families. Your first glimpse of the ship itself is overwhelming. It's not just big. It's a floating city of wood and canvas, towering over the water, its dark hull pockmarked with gun ports like empty eye sockets. This isn't a quick trip across the channel. This is a long-term, possibly lifelong, commitment to the unforgiving sea. As you're herded up the gangplank, the ship seems to groan under its own weight, a living, breathing leviathan. The air is thick with the scent of tar, brine, and something metallic and vaguely unpleasant that you'll soon learn is the smell of 1,000 men packed too tightly, living and dying within these wooden walls. A rough hand shoves you forward, and you stumble onto the deck, a vast expanse of weathered planks. Above you, a dizzying tangle of ropes and spars reaches towards the sky, like a monstrous spiderweb. You instinctively duck as a block and tackle swings precariously close to your head. No, welcome aboard, speech here, just shouted orders and the constant, rhythmic creaking of the ship. You quickly realize that personal space is a concept alien to this environment. Every inch of the ship is utilized, every corner teeming with activity or stored provisions. You're assigned to a mess, a small group of men with whom you'll share everything from your meager rations to your sleeping space. Your bed is a hammock slung just inches from your neighbors, swaying with the ship's motion. You might be sharing a hammock with another sailor on an alternating watch system. One sleeps while the other works, then you swap. Talk about getting to know your shipmates intimately, whether you want to or not. There are no private cabins for the likes of you, no quiet corners for reflection. The constant noise, the proximity of hundreds of other bodies, the lack of privacy, it's an assault on your senses, a stripping away of all personal boundaries. You're no longer an individual. You're a unit, a cog in the vast machinery of the Royal Navy. The petty officer barks at you to find your hammock, pointing vaguely into the gloom below deck. You try to remember which rope is which, feeling a surge of panic as the reality of your situation sinks in. This isn't just a tough journey. It's a completely new existence, one you're completely unprepared for. As you descend into the lower decks, a new world, dark and oppressive, envelopes you. The light from the hatch above quickly fades, swallowed by the ship's cavernous interior. Here, the air is thick, stale, and heavy with the scent of damp wood, unwashed bodies, and the ever-present, nauseating tang of bilge water. It's not just the smell, it's the feeling of a clammy, oppressive atmosphere that seems to cling to your skin. This is the belly of the beast, where hundreds of men live, eat, and sleep in conditions that would make a modern-day sardine can feel spacious. The hammocks, which you were just told to find, hang in seemingly endless rows, each one a canvas cocoon suspended precariously close to its neighbor. You quickly learn that stepping on someone else's hammock while they're sleeping is a cardinal sin, often met with a swift, if deserved, punch in the dark. The lack of natural light is immediate and profound. Below the gun deck, lanterns offer only weak, flickering pools of illumination, casting long, dancing shadows that make the already cramped spaces feel even more claustrophobic. You learn to navigate by feel, your hands brushing against rough timbers and unseen obstacles. This constant gloom breeds a peculiar kind of intimacy among the crew, an enforced proximity that can either forge strong bonds or intense animosity. There's no escaping your shipmates here. Their coughs, their snores, their whispered conversations are your constant companions. You find your own hammock, a surprisingly flimsy piece of canvas, and wonder how you're ever going to sleep suspended like some kind of human chrysalis. The idea of getting a good night's rest, like so many other comforts, seems utterly preposterous. Sanitation, as you might imagine, is a rather flexible concept in this floating iron lung. There are no proper toilets. Instead, you're directed to heads at the bow of the ship, essentially communal wooden seats over the open sea. Privacy is non-existent, and modesty quickly becomes a forgotten luxury. Washing facilities are equally rudimentary. You might get a bucket of seawater, if you're lucky, and if you're truly desperate, a piece of old canvas to scrub yourself. Fresh water for drinking is carefully rationed, making personal hygiene a low priority compared to hydration. The result, predictably, is a pervasive body odor that becomes just another layer in the ship's overall sensory experience. Historians still argue whether the widespread use of grog was more for its perceived medicinal qualities in preventing scurvy, or simply to make the dreadful conditions more bearable by dulling the senses. It certainly didn't help with personal cleanliness. Disease, naturally, is rampant in such close, unsanitary quarters. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and the dreaded scurvy were constant companions on long voyages. A cough could quickly spread through an entire mess, and a single case of fever could decimate a crew. The ship's surgeon, a man who might have had some basic medical training, or perhaps was just an enthusiastic amateur, would be your only hope. His tools would be rudimentary at best. A saw for amputations, a few basic instruments, and a collection of often ineffective herbal remedies. You'd likely see more of his work than you'd care to men screaming through amputations, the cries of the sick, and the daily ritual of bodies being sewn into canvas and slid overboard. It's a grim reminder that merely surviving a battle is only half the fight. The other half is against the invisible, microbial enemies within the ship itself. Every corner of the ship has a purpose, and often, that purpose involves something dangerous. Above your head, cannonballs might be stacked in racks, or powder monkeys, young boys who carried gunpowder, might scurry past, their faces grimed with dirt. Below you, in the hold, rats would be your constant, scuttling companions, feasting on spilled rations and anything else they could get their teeth into. These weren't your cute city rats. These were big, bold, ocean-going rodents, some of them reputedly as large as small cats. A sailor once told a yarn about waking up to a rat gnawing on his earlobe, mistaking it for a piece of cheese. Probably just a story, but it captures the essence of the constant battle against pests. The sheer noise is another constant assault. The creak and groan of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull. the shouts of officers, the rhythmic clang of the ship's pump, and the never-ending hum of men talking, singing, or simply enduring. You quickly learn to sleep through it all, or you don't sleep at all. This ship is a microcosm of chaos, a universe unto itself, and you are but a tiny, vulnerable speck within its vast, unforgiving confines. Your rude awakening continues the moment the ship's bell strikes, often long before dawn. There's no gentle alarm clock, no snooze button, just the jarring clang and the shouted commands of the bosun's mate. You tumble out of your hammock, still groggy and aching, and immediately become part of the ship's perpetual motion machine. This is the sailor's grueling daily grind, an endless cycle of tasks designed to keep the ship in peak condition and its crew on the edge of exhaustion. From the moment your feet hit the deck, you're working or preparing to work. There's little time for personal reflection and absolutely no room for idleness. Laziness, you quickly learn, is not tolerated and swiftly punished. The morning typically begins with holy stoning the deck. Imagine scrubbing the deck planks with sand and large, flat stones, often on your hands and knees, to keep them clean and free of splinters. This isn't just about hygiene. It's a form of physical conditioning and discipline, a way to start the day with strenuous, monotonous labor. Your muscles quickly protest, but there's no relief, only the constant supervision of an officer or a petty officer whose keen eyes miss nothing. A quick swill of grog, if you're lucky, might provide a temporary jolt, but the work never truly stops. You'll carry coils of heavy rope, haul on lines, and endlessly scrub and swab. The ship is a living entity, and you are one of its many diligent, if unwilling, caretakers. Throughout the day, your tasks vary, but the intensity remains constant. You'll be assigned to a specific watch, usually 4 hours on, 4 hours off, though this often gets disrupted by emergencies or battle preparations. During your watch, you might be aloft, clinging to the rigging high above the deck, wrestling with massive canvas sails in all weathers. This is where true seamanship is born out of necessity and sheer terror. One slip, one moment of inattention, and the unforgiving ocean awaits. You learn the intricate names of every rope, every spar, and every sail, not from a textbook, but from the urgent, shouted commands of your superiors. On the main brace. Reef the fore topsail. These aren't suggestions. They are commands that demand immediate, coordinated action. Historians still argue whether the complexity of naval jargon was designed to truly enhance communication or simply to intimidate new recruits and reinforce hierarchy. Either way, you'll pick it up quickly or pay the price. Below deck, other tasks await. You might be working the pumps, tirelessly removing the constant ingress of bilge water, a crucial job to keep the ship afloat. Or perhaps you're mending sails, patching holes torn by wind or shot, your fingers quickly growing calloused and nimble with the needle. There's the constant maintenance of the guns, ensuring they are clean, oiled, and ready for action. You might be detailed to the galley, helping with the preparation of the monotonous meals or assisting the carpenter with repairs. Every man has a role, and every role is vital to the ship's function. There's no room for specialization to the point of not knowing other jobs. A sailor was expected to be a jack of all trades, adaptable to any demand. The discipline is unyielding. An officer's word is law, and questioning it, even with a raised eyebrow, is an invitation for severe punishment. You learn to move with efficiency, to anticipate orders, and to suppress any personal feelings or opinions. Social hierarchy aboard a Royal Navy ship was incredibly strict, a pyramid with the captain at its apex, his word absolute. Below him, the officers, then the petty officers, and finally, the common seaman like yourself at the very bottom. You learn to address officers with deference and to never, ever show insolence. One quirky tidbit you might notice is that sometimes sailors would wear a small pigtail or cue their hair, a fashion that was practical for keeping long hair out of the way, but also enforced uniformity and ease of inspection, almost like a strange, collective military hairstyle competition that no one really asked to enter. It's a subtle reminder that even your appearance is dictated by the Navy, not by your own preference. This relentless routine, this constant exertion, is designed not just to maintain the ship, but to break down individual will and forge a cohesive, obedient unit, ready to face any challenge or any enemy. If you thought the constant labor was your biggest challenge, just wait until the dinner bell rings. Or rather, the call for mess sounds, because dinner bell suggests something rather pleasant, and very little about the food in Lord Nelson's Navy was pleasant. This section, my friend, is dedicated to hardtack, grog, and scurvy, the unholy trinity of naval sustenance. You quickly discover that your appetite, honed by hours of backbreaking work, will still struggle with the reality of the rations. The primary staple, and your daily tormentor, is hardtack. Imagine a biscuit so incredibly tough, so unyielding, that it could probably survive a direct cannonball hit. These weren't baked for flavor or freshness. They were baked for indefinite preservation. To eat it, you'd often have to soak it in water, or, if you were feeling brave, chip off a corner and soften it with your saliva, risking a broken tooth in the process. You'd also quickly learn about its permanent, tiny residents, weevils. These little beetle larvae were an unavoidable protein supplement, so common that sailors often just ate them along with the biscuit, considering them part of the deal. One sailor reportedly quipped that a ship's biscuit was mostly holes and weevils, with just enough flour to hold them together. A light-hearted joke, perhaps, but born of a grim reality. Beyond the hardtack, your diet was incredibly monotonous and utterly lacking in fresh produce. Salted beef and pork, preserved in brine, formed the bulk of your protein. This meat, often years old, would be so tough and salty that it required extensive soaking before cooking. Even then, it would often be stringy, flavorless, and difficult to chew. You'd quickly realize why a good set of teeth was a sailor's most valuable possession, alongside his wits. There might be some peas or oatmeal, but fresh fruits and vegetables were almost non-existent, especially on long voyages. This leads us directly to the scourge of the seas, scurvy. Scurvy is caused by a severe deficiency of vitamin C, something readily available in fresh fruits and vegetables. Without it, your body starts to break down. You notice your gums bleeding, your teeth loosening, and old wounds reopening. You'd feel incredibly weak, lethargic, and your skin might develop strange, purplish spots. It was a slow, agonizing decline, and it killed more sailors than battle ever did. Entire crews could be decimated by scurvy on long voyages, their bodies failing them, their minds clouded by sickness. While James Lind had, decades earlier, demonstrated that citrus fruits could prevent scurvy, and Captain Cook had famously kept his crews healthy with sauerkraut and other preserved foods, the regular, widespread provision of such items was a logistical nightmare for the Royal Navy, and often inconsistent. So, you just have to hope your particular ship's captain was progressive, or that your voyage was short. Historians still argue whether the Navy's slowness to fully adopt citrus was due to ignorance, cost, or a fundamental misunderstanding of the disease's cause, rather than just treating the symptoms. Now for the liquid gold, or perhaps the liquid curse, grog. To prevent water from going stagnant in the ship's casks, it was mixed with rum. This mixture, typically a quart of water to half a pint of rum, was issued daily. It was called grog, named after Admiral Edward Vernon, who supposedly wore a Grogram cloak and was nicknamed Old Grog. For many sailors, this daily ration was the highlight of their day, a brief escape from the drudgery and discomfort. It provided warmth, a temporary feeling of well-being, and helped dull the gnawing pangs of hunger and the constant aches in your body. However, it also led to widespread drunkenness, which, as you can imagine, was a major problem on a ship with strict discipline and complex machinery. Fighting, accidents, and insubordination were all fueled by the generous grog allowance. You'd see men descend into alcoholism, their lives consumed by the desire for their next ration. While it provided comfort, It also contributed to a cycle of dependency and self-destruction. And no, it didn't do anything for the scurvy, although some undoubtedly believed it did. It merely made you feel better about having scurvy. So, while you might dream of a hearty, home-cooked meal, your reality is a wooden biscuit, salted meat, and a daily tot of rum. This meager diet, combined with the relentless physical exertion and the unsanitary conditions, guaranteed that your body was constantly under siege. You are what you eat, and in the Royal Navy, you're mostly stale bread, tough meat, and a whole lot of weevils. The harsh conditions, the grueling labor, and the abysmal food all coalesced into a single, ever-present force aboard a Royal Navy ship: discipline. And discipline, in this era, was often synonymous with brutality. This section plunges you into the grim reality of the lash, the flog, and mutiny, where punishment was swift, public, and often terrifyingly severe. You quickly learned that an officer's word isn't just law. It's backed by the constant threat of physical pain. Even minor infractions, like a misplaced tool or a moment of perceived idleness, could earn you a sharp rebuke or worse. The goal wasn't just to correct behavior. It was to instill fear and absolute obedience, to break the individual spirit and mold it into a compliant part of the ship's crew. The most common and feared punishment was the cat o' nine tails, or simply the cat. This was a whip with 9 knotted cords, designed to lacerate the skin. Imagine being stripped to the waist, tied to a grating or a mast, and enduring strokes across your bare back. The number of lashes could range from a dozen for minor offenses to several dozen, or even hundreds for more serious ones. Each stroke was delivered by a strong, experienced seaman, often the bosun's mate, who would put his full weight into it. The sound of the whip cutting through the air, followed by the sickening thud against flesh, would echo across the deck, a chilling lesson for all to witness. You'd be forced to watch, alongside the rest of the crew, as a shipmate endured this torment, the screams and the blood a stark reminder of your own precarious position. The pain, the humiliation, and the public spectacle were designed to leave an indelible mark, not just on the victim, but on everyone present. Beyond the cat, there were other forms of physical discipline. You might be forced to endure the starting, a rapid, informal beating with a rope's end or a stick for minor offenses. Or, for something a bit more public but less severe than the cat, you might be put in irons, chained to the deck for hours or even days, exposed to the elements and the scorn of your shipmates. For extreme cases of insubordination or mutiny, the punishment could be death, usually by hanging from a yardarm, a final, horrifying spectacle meant to crush any thoughts of rebellion. The body would be left hanging for a time, a grim warning against challenging authority. Historians still argue whether the extreme brutality of naval discipline was truly effective in maintaining order or whether it merely bred resentment and desperation, pushing men to the very brink of rebellion. And sometimes, men were pushed to the brink. Mutiny, the ultimate act of defiance against authority, was a rare but terrifying prospect for officers. It represented a complete breakdown of the rigid social order and could have catastrophic consequences for both the mutineers and the ship itself. Famous mutinies, like that of the Bounty, captivated the public imagination, but many smaller, less celebrated acts of insubordination occurred. These often stemmed from intolerable conditions, sadistic officers, or the belief that the crew was being deliberately cheated or abused. While a successful mutiny might offer a fleeting taste of freedom, the retribution, should the mutineers be caught, was swift and merciless. They faced courts-martial and the ultimate penalty. One quirky tidbit: some desperate sailors would intentionally injure themselves, perhaps by shooting off a finger, to be considered unfit for service and discharged. This grim act, known as coining a shilling, as a shilling was the value of the finger, was itself a punishable offense if discovered, but for some, the lure of freedom outweighed the risk. So, as you go about your daily tasks, you're always keenly aware of the watchful eyes of the officers. Your every move, every word, every expression is scrutinized. The fear of the lash, the fear of public humiliation, and the very real possibility of death for serious transgression hang over you like the ever-present smell of the bilge. It's a system designed to crush individuality and forge conformity, where your body is merely a tool, and your will is expected to be entirely subservient to the needs of the ship and the Royal Navy. The idea of rights or fairness is a foreign concept. There is only obedience and the consequences of its absence. With the constant threat of the lash looming, your next challenge is to actually become a functioning sailor. You quickly realize that a ship, especially a warship of the line, is an incredibly complex machine, and you, as a new recruit, are utterly ignorant of its workings. This is where you begin learning the ropes, literally a process that is less about formal education and more about frantic, on-the-job training, usually accompanied by shouted insults and occasional shoves. There's no classroom, no manual, just the immediate demand to understand and perform. You learn by doing, by observing, and by being screamed at when you do it wrong. Your first few days are a blur of new terminology and dizzying heights. Above your head, the ship's rigging is a bewildering maze of lines, blocks, and spars. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands, of ropes, each with a specific name and purpose. To the uninitiated, it looks like a gigantic spider web, but to a seasoned sailor, it's a meticulously organized system. You're expected to learn the name and function of every single one. Forget port and starboard. You're suddenly trying to distinguish between the royal mast, the topgallant mast, the foretopmast stay, and the main brace. It's like being dropped into a foreign country where everyone speaks in nautical riddles. One of the more peculiar early lessons might involve learning how to properly coil a rope, not just to keep the deck tidy, but to prevent it from snagging or kinking at a critical moment. It sounds simple, but there's an art to it, and a poorly coiled rope could lead to chaos during an emergency. Your physical transformation begins almost immediately. You find muscles you never knew you had, screaming in protest from hauling on lines, climbing the shrouds, and wrestling with massive sails. The ship's motion, initially nauseating, slowly becomes a part of you, your body instinctively swaying and balancing with every roll and pitch. You learn to move with efficiency and purpose, scurrying across the deck during maneuvers, scrambling aloft at dizzying speeds. The heights are terrifying at first. Looking down from the topmast, the ship below seems impossibly small, the waves an endless, hungry expanse. But you suppress the fear, because fear means hesitation, and hesitation can mean falling, or worse, jeopardizing the ship. Sailors quickly developed a kind of instinctual balance, able to walk along narrow spars in a rolling sea without conscious thought. Historians still argue whether this physical hardening was more a result of relentless training or simply the natural selection of those hardy enough to survive the initial brutal period. Beyond the physical demands, you also begin to grasp the ship's internal hierarchy. The Royal Navy was a strictly stratified society. At the top was the captain, an absolute monarch within his wooden kingdom. His word was literally law, and his personality, whether benevolent or tyrannical, shaped the entire atmosphere of the ship. Below him were the lieutenants, then the master, responsible for navigation, and the surgeon, the only person with any medical expertise. Then came the warrant officers like the boatswain, the gunner, and the carpenter, experienced seamen who held permanent positions and oversaw specific departments. And finally, the petty officers, essentially the foreman of the ship, who directly supervised the common seamen like yourself. You learn to respect and often fear these ranks, understanding that defiance means punishment. A quirky tidbit: some captains believe in strictly enforcing the salt horse rule, meaning fresh meat could only be eaten on specific holidays, ensuring that the crew remained toughened by the standard salted rations. It was a strange blend of tradition and a somewhat misguided belief in fostering hardiness. You start to recognize the different calls and whistles, understanding what each piping of the boatswain's whistle signifies: all hands to quarters, away all boats, or simply dinner. This auditory language becomes as important as spoken commands. Slowly, painstakingly, you begin to transform from a bewildered landsman into a useful, if still very junior, part of the ship's crew. You might even feel a tiny, fleeting spark of pride when you successfully complete a complex task without fumbling, or when a seasoned sailor gives you a nod of grudging approval. But don't get too comfortable. The sea itself has a few more lessons to teach you. Just when you thought you were getting the hang of life aboard a man of war, the ship reminds you who's truly in charge. Beyond the brutality of the officers and the relentless labor, there's an even more formidable adversary, the sea itself. This section brings you face to face with the peril of the high seas, where the very environment you inhabit can turn from a highway to a hellscape in a matter of hours. You're not just sailing on the ocean, you're constantly battling against it. Imagine a calm, sunny morning, the sea a gentle swell, almost lulling you into a false sense of security. Then, the sky darkens, the wind picks up with an unsettling howl, and the ship, that immense wooden fortress, begins to dance uncontrollably. A gale descends, transforming the ocean into a churning, mountainous chaos. Waves, once mere ripples, become towering walls of water, crashing over the decks with unimaginable force. You're no longer just walking, you're bracing yourself against every lurch and roll, clinging to anything solid to avoid being flung across the deck or worse, overboard. The constant spray of salt water lashes your face, stinging your eyes and soaking your threadbare clothes, leaving you perpetually cold and damp. One quirky tidbit about these storms is how much the ship groaned and shrieked the timbers would actually rub against each other, creating a terrifying symphony of protest that sounded, to a superstitious sailor, like the ship itself was alive and in agony. During such a storm, every hand is needed, regardless of your watch. You'd be ordered to reef the sails, a terrifying task that involves scrambling aloft into the thrashing rigging, often in the dead of night, with lightning illuminating the chaotic scene. You're battling not just the wind, which threatens to tear the canvas from your grasp, but also the violent pitching and rolling of the ship, which tries to shake you loose from your precarious perch. Your fingers, raw and numb from the cold and wet, struggle with the frozen ropes. One wrong step, one moment of panic, and you're plunged into the icy depths, a mere speck in the vast, indifferent ocean. The roar of the wind, the crash of the waves, and the shouted commands of officers fighting to be heard over the tempest create an almost sensory overload. You realize just how fragile this wooden vessel is against the sheer power of nature. Beyond the immediate danger of storms, there were the less dramatic but equally persistent threats. The constant dampness, the lack of fresh water, and the poor diet could leave you vulnerable to illness even without a visible storm. Then there's the ever-present threat of collision, especially in crowded shipping lanes or during night watches, when another vessel might appear out of the darkness with terrifying speed. A momentary lapse in judgment from a watchman, or simply bad luck, could result in a catastrophic impact, tearing a hole in the hull and sending your entire world to the bottom. Historians still argue whether some of the most famous shipwrecks were primarily due to navigational error, poor ship construction, or simply the overwhelming, unpredictable power of the elements. It's a debate that matters little when you're clinging to a splintering mast in a freezing sea. And let's not forget the mundane but deadly hazards. Ropes snapping, spars collapsing, heavy objects shifting in the hold, all capable of crushing or maiming you in an instant. A sudden, unexpected roll of the ship could send a loose cannonball careening across the deck, or sweep a man overboard before anyone could react. The ocean itself was full of perils beyond storm's uncharted reefs, hidden sandbars, and even the simple, silent, deceptive calm that could precede a sudden squall. You live in a constant state of alert, your senses heightened, your body primed for emergency, because on the high seas, danger is not an exception, it's the rule. You quickly learn that the ship, for all its imposing size, is merely a thin shell separating you from an unimaginable abyss. Despite the constant battle against the elements and the brutal discipline, there was one purpose that overshadowed all others for a warship: combat. You might have been pressed into service, but now, whether you liked it or not, you were part of a fighting machine. This section details the arduous process of preparing for the cannon's roar, the drills and routines that transformed a disparate group of men into a cohesive, deadly force. There was no room for individualism here. Your survival and the survival of the ship depended on absolute synchronization. The training was relentless, repetitive, and often terrifying. You'd spend hours, day after day, practicing gunnery drills. Imagine a cacophony of shouted orders, the thud of cannonballs being lifted, and the squeal of trucks as the enormous guns were run out. You'd be assigned to a gun crew, typically comprising 10 to 14 men, each with a specific role. You might be a powder monkey, a young boy whose terrifying job it was to ferry gunpowder cartridges from the magazine deep below deck to the guns, risking instantaneous incineration if a spark ignited his volatile cargo. Or you might be a loader, wrestling the heavy cannonball into the barrel, or a sponger, swabbing out the barrel after each shot to prevent embers from igniting the next charge prematurely. The drill was practiced over and over, sometimes with live fire, sometimes just with emotions, until every man moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine. It was a dance of death, choreographed to perfection. One quirky tidbit: some older, superstitious sailors believed that a particularly loud or well-aimed shot was helped by spitting into the barrel before loading. A bizarre ritual that did absolutely nothing but provided a sense of control in an uncontrollable situation. Beyond the guns, you'd practice general quarters drills. This was the command that signaled imminent battle, and the ship would erupt into a flurry of organized chaos. Every man would rush to his assigned station, some to the guns, others to the rigging to furl sails, to reduce the tartar profile, others to the pumps, ready to deal with shot holes. Hammocks, your only form of comfort, would be swiftly rolled up and stowed in the netting along the bulwarks, acting as a crude form of splinter protection. The decks would be sanded to provide better footing, and the medical bays, or cockpit, prepared to receive the wounded. There was a chilling efficiency to it all, a quiet professionalism that belied the horror that was about to unfold. You'd hear the grind of the capstan as the anchor was weighed, the shouts of officers, and the distant, muffled drumbeat calling men to their posts. Historians still argue whether the Royal Navy's emphasis on continuous drill was more crucial to their victories than superior ship design or the sheer number of vessels. What is clear is that this intense preparation made a huge difference when the cannons finally roared. The sheer physical exertion of these drills was immense. Hauling on ropes, manhandling heavy guns, and scurrying through the ship's labyrinthine passages left you breathless and aching. But the mental preparation was perhaps even more grueling. You were constantly reminded of the stakes, of the enemy that lay over the horizon. The officers, while brutal, were also expert at instilling a fierce sense of loyalty to the ship and the nation. You might hate your life, but you'd fight for it and for your shipmates. There was a strange kind of camaraderie forged in the shared suffering and the common purpose of battle. When the order finally came to clear for action, a collective grim determination would settle over the crew. You'd feel the tension, a palpable hum of anticipation mixed with fear as the ship prepared to transform from a sailing vessel into a floating fortress, ready to unleash its destructive power. The moment finally arrives, a chilling silence preceding the storm. You hear the lookouts shout, the orders ring out, and then the terrifying reality. Another ship, the enemy, emerges from the haze. This is it. This is the chaos of close quarters combat, the ultimate test of everything you've endured. The meticulously rehearsed drills suddenly become a blur of instinct and sheer terror. You're no longer just a sailor. You're a warrior, whether you volunteer for the role or not. The first sound that truly registers is the thud and roar of your own ship's broadside. The entire vessel shudders violently as the cannons unleash their thunderous fury. Imagine standing just feet from a battery of enormous guns, the air momentarily sucked from your lungs by the concussion, your ears ringing from the deafening blast. Then comes the smell, acrid gunpowder smoke, thick and choking, instantly filling the air, mingling with the scent of burning wood and terrified sweat. Visibility drops to almost zero as the smoke billows across the deck, turning the world into a disorienting, infernal fog. You struggle to see your shipmates, relying on shouts and the familiar scrape of gun trucks to know where you are. One quirky tidbit: some sailors, in the moments before battle, would actually chew on a piece of leather or a bullet, ostensibly to prevent them from biting off their tongue from the sheer shock of a cannon blast, a small, desperate act of self-preservation in the face of overwhelming noise. Then, the enemy returns fire. The impact of a cannonball striking your ship is unlike anything you've ever experienced. It's a sickening crunch, a splintering explosion of wood that sends deadly splinters flying in every direction. These splinters, essentially wooden shrapnel, could be as lethal as the cannonballs themselves, tearing through flesh and bone with brutal efficiency. You hear the screams of the wounded, the desperate cries for the surgeon. The deck, moments ago so familiar, becomes a treacherous landscape of tangled ropes, shattered timber, and the growing, horrifying slick of blood. You duck, you flinch, but you keep moving because hesitation means death. You're reloading, sponging, running out the gun. Your movements automatic, driven by sheer adrenaline and the overwhelming desire to survive. The engagement is a maelstrom of sensory overload. The constant roar of cannon fire, the crack of muskets from the tops, the sharp twang of severed rigging, the crash of falling spars, and the agonizing screams of the injured create an unholy symphony of destruction. You see flashes of flame through the smoke, glimpses of the enemy's ship, her rigging torn, her hull splintered. The objective is simple: inflict more damage than you receive. But it's not just about cannon fire. Should the ships come close enough, grappling hooks would be thrown, and the command to board would ring out. This is where it becomes even more personal. You'd be expected to arm yourself with cutlass or boarding pike and charge across the narrow gap onto the enemy deck, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat. This was less about grand strategy and more about raw, desperate violence, a swirling melee of steel and desperate men fighting for their lives. Historians still argue whether the psychological impact of close-quarters fighting, with its horrific sights and sounds, was more detrimental to long-term sailor morale than the physical injuries sustained. Amidst this terrifying chaos, you might see acts of incredible bravery, or equally, acts of profound despair. Men fighting despite grievous wounds, or men simply giving up, overwhelmed by the horror. Your life, once so seemingly insignificant, suddenly hangs by the thinnest thread, a mere moment away from being extinguished by a stray shot, a falling mast, or the thrust of an enemy cutlass. There's no time for thought, only reaction. You are a small, desperate part of a much larger, incredibly violent machine, and your only goal is to keep that machine firing, even as it crumbles around you. The thunderous roars subside, the smoke begins to dissipate, and a chilling silence descends, broken only by groans and the creaking of damaged timbers. The battle is over, but the fight for survival continues in a new, grim form. This is the aftermath: wounds, death, and despair, where the true cost of naval warfare becomes horrifically apparent. You quickly learn that victory doesn't mean safety, and defeat means an even deeper descent into suffering. The deck, once a vibrant, organized space, is now a scene of utter devastation. Splinters, as lethal as any projectile, are everywhere, embedded in the wood, in ropes, and sickeningly, in the flesh of your shipmates. The once pristine planks are now slick with blood, making every step treacherous. You see bodies, some mangled beyond recognition, others simply lifeless, lying where they fell. The ship's surgeon and his assistants, often just young boys, are already at work in the cockpit. which is quickly transformed into a gruesome butcher's shop. Amputations are common, swift, and agonizingly painful, performed without anesthetic beyond a slug of rum or a leather strap to bite on. The saw, the knife, the searing iron to cauterize wounds, these are the tools of the trade, and the screams of the wounded are the soundtrack to this grim process. You might be pressed in a service helping carry the injured, or simply standing by, witnessing the raw agony of men whose lives are irrevocably altered in a single moment. Death is a constant companion. For those who don't survive, the disposal is quick and unceremonious. Bodies are sewn into canvas sacks, often with a cannonball at their feet to ensure they sink, and then simply slid overboard. There are no eulogies, no elaborate ceremonies, just a quiet splash as another life is returned to the indifferent sea. It's a stark reminder of your own mortality and the cheapness of life aboard a warship. You might have just fought alongside a man, shared a grog ration with him, and now he's gone, leaving barely a ripple. This swift disposal was not just about practicality. It was also about preventing the spread of disease from decomposing bodies in the cramped confines of the ship. One quirky tidbit: sometimes, if a sailor had a particularly cherished possession, like a pipe or a small carving, a shipmate might discreetly tuck it into his canvas shroud before he went overboard. A small, private gesture of farewell. Beyond the physical wounds, the psychological toll is immense. The constant stress, the terror of battle, and the sight of so much suffering and death leave an indelible mark. Many sailors suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, though in that era, it was simply called ship fever or dismissed as cowardice. Sleep would be restless, haunted by the sounds and images of battle. The camaraderie forged in combat, while strong, was also tinged with the knowledge that any one of your new friends could be gone in the next engagement. Historians still argue whether the high rates of desertion after major battles were more a result of physical incapacitation or the overwhelming psychological burden of combat. Your ship, too, bears the scars of battle. Masts might be splintered, sails torn to ribbons, rigging a tangled mess. The pumps would be working furiously, trying to keep ahead of any new leaks. The immediate task for the surviving crew is damage control, shoring up weak points, patching holes, and tending to the wounded. There's little time for mourning, only for action, because the sea, and potentially another enemy ship, still pose a threat. The ship might be limping, but it must remain afloat, a testament to the resilience of its timbers and the grim determination of its battered crew. You've survived the roar, but now you face the silent, haunting aftermath, a landscape of pain, loss, and the ever-present shadow of despair. Having miraculously survived the battle, perhaps even escaped the surgeon's saw, your thoughts might turn, however fleetingly, to the spoils of war. This brings us to prize money, plunder, and poverty, a deeply unequal system where the vast majority of sailors rarely saw significant financial gain, while officers could amass fortunes. You might have participated in the capture of an enemy vessel, known as a prize, and the dream of a share of its value, however small, could be a powerful motivator. When an enemy ship was captured, it was brought before an admiralty court, condemned, and then sold. The proceeds, theoretically, were distributed among the crew. However, the distribution was heavily skewed. The captain, and even more so the admiral in command of the squadron, would receive the lion's share, often a colossal sum that could set them up for life. Lieutenants and warrant officers would receive respectable amounts. But for the common sailor, your share would be minuscule, a mere pittance compared to the dangers you faced. You might receive a few pounds, if anything at all, after all the legal fees, deductions, and delays. Payment could take months, even years, to materialize, and by then, many sailors were either dead, discharged, or had simply given up hope. One quirky tidbit: sometimes, if a prize was particularly valuable and the news spread, unscrupulous merchants or taverners ashore would offer sailors credit, knowing they had prize money coming, and effectively fleece them of their future earnings before they even received them. Beyond prize money, there was the more immediate, informal gain, plunder. This was the small-scale looting of personal effects from a captured ship, done quickly before officers could intervene or the ship was officially secured. You might snatch a bottle of wine, a piece of clothing, or some small trinket. This was technically illegal, but often tolerated to a degree, a small concession to the common sailor for his efforts. It was a chaotic scramble, and the most valuable items were usually claimed by officers or seized for the official prize. So, while you might dream of finding a chest of gold doubloons, your reality was more likely a slightly damp coat or a half-empty rum bottle. Historians still argue whether the Navy tolerated petty plunder to maintain morale, or simply because it was impossible to prevent entirely, given the chaos of a captured ship. But the stark reality for most common seamen was poverty. Your basic pay was meager, and even though it was often subject to deductions for slops, clothing, tobacco, and other necessities purchased from the purser's stores, which were often overpriced. Long voyages meant little opportunity to spend what little you earned, but it also meant that your family ashore, if you had one, would receive little or no support from you. Many sailors' families were forced into extreme poverty, relying on charity or parish relief. Upon discharge, especially after a long period of service, you might receive a small sum, but without a trade or connections, you'd quickly find yourself destitute and facing the constant threat of reimpressment. So, while the stories of officers making their fortunes from prize money were true, they were the exception, not the rule, for the vast majority of men who fought and died for the Royal Navy. For you, the likely outcome of your service, even after surviving the cannon's roar and the surgeon's knife, was a return to the grinding poverty from which you were so cruelly taken. The promise of riches was a mirage. The reality was hard labor, danger, and often a final return to the very bottom of society, perhaps even worse off than when you began. You've braved storms, witnessed battle, and perhaps even scraped together a few measly shillings of prize money. Now, after months or even years at sea, the ship finally drops anchor in a bustling port. This is your fleeting glimpse of life ashore, brief respite or ruin. For many sailors, shore leave was a desperate dash to experience all the pleasures denied to them at sea, often leading to rapid dissipation of any meager earnings and a swift return to destitution. The moment you step on a solid ground, a strange feeling washes over you. The world doesn't sway beneath your feet anymore, but your body still compensates, making you feel momentarily off kilter, like you're walking on an invisible deck. The smells are different too, not just the pervasive scent of tar and salt, but the aroma of fresh bread, roasting meat, and the less savory tang of open sewers and crowded streets. You're immediately overwhelmed by the sheer variety of sights and sounds. Hawkers shouting their wares, laughing women, children playing, and the endless stream of people going about their lives that feel impossibly distant from your own. It's a vivid, almost shocking contrast to the monotonous, confined world of the ship. One quirky tidbit: some sailors, after months at sea, found the silence of land almost unnerving, preferring the familiar creaks and groans of the ship to the quiet. Your first stop, inevitably, is often a tavern or a brothel. These establishments thrived near every major port, catering specifically to sailors with pockets full of unspent wages. The allure of cheap grog, female company, and a momentary escape from the grim reality of naval life was almost irresistible. You'd likely spend your precious few pounds on drink, gambling, and fleeting pleasures. It was a rapid, often reckless expenditure, fueled by the knowledge that this freedom was temporary and your earnings might be all you'd ever see. The urge to blow it all, to live for the moment, was overwhelming because tomorrow or the day after, you'd be back on the ship, back to the grind. Historians still argue whether the high rates of venereal disease among sailors were a greater threat to naval effectiveness than battle casualties themselves, highlighting the darker side of shore leave. While ashore, you might try to reconnect with family, if they even knew where you were or if you had any left. But for many, the ties have been severed by years of absence or impressment. You might try to find a hot meal that wasn't salt pork or hardtack, savoring every bite of fresh food. Perhaps you try to purchase some new clothes, though your naval uniform would still mark you as a sailor, a potential target for press gangs if you weren't careful. The port towns were rife with con artists, eager to relieve you of your wages through rigged games or inflated prices. You were a walking target, a man with little experience of managing money and a desperate need for instant gratification. For those few with some foresight, or perhaps those who had a longer period of leave, there might be a brief attempt to find temporary work or simply enjoy a quiet period of rest. But the constant threat of reimpressment hung over every moment ashore. Naval patrols, often aided by local constables, would sweep through taverns and docks, looking for able-bodied men to replenish the fleet. Your brief taste of freedom could be snatched away in an instant, plunging you back into the very life you just escaped. So, while the land offered a momentary reprieve, it was often a fleeting, dangerous interlude that merely highlighted the stark contrast between your temporary freedom and the long-term bondage of naval service. That brief taste of freedom ashore, however fleeting, only sharpens the constant, gnawing anxiety that follows every sailor who has ever felt the press gang's heavy hand. This section explores the shadow of impressment and escape, a perpetual cat-and-mouse game between the Royal Navy's insatiable demand for manpower and the individual's desperate longing for liberty. You live with the knowledge that even on land, you are never truly free, and every shadow could conceal a recruiting officer. The fear of reimpressment is a powerful, ever-present force. It dictates where you go, who you talk to, and how long you dare to stay in one place. You learn to recognize the telltale signs. A group of burly men in naval uniform, perhaps accompanied by local constables, sweeping through a tavern or market square. Your heart would pound in your chest, and every instinct would scream, run. You might try to blend in with the crowd, adopt a stooped posture, or feign an injury, anything to avoid the keen eye of a press gang. They were often ruthless, less concerned with legality than with filling quotas. Even if you had a protection certificate, proving you were exempt, perhaps due to being a foreign national or having previously served your time, it might be ignored or even torn up by an overzealous press officer desperate for bodies. Historians still argue whether the economic benefit of impressment outweighed the societal disruption and resentment it caused, fueling anti-government sentiment among the working class. For those desperate enough, escape became the only option. This could mean desertion while on shore leave, a perilous gamble. If caught, the punishment was severe, often a public flogging, or even death in times of war. But for many, the risk was worth the potential reward of a life free from the lash, the grog, and the constant threat of battle. You might try to make your way inland, far from any port, or seek passage on a merchant ship, hoping to find a captain willing to turn a blind eye to your naval past. Some attempted to disguise themselves, cutting off their distinctive pigtails or exchanging their naval attire for civilian clothes, though a sailor's gait and sun-weathered face often gave them away. One quirky tidbit: some desperate sailors would seek out tattoos of an anchor or a ship, not just for pride, but paradoxically, as a form of anti-impressment measure. The idea was that a visible tattoo might indicate prior service, and thus, theoretically, you might be less likely to be impressed again if the Navy thought you'd already done your duty. In practice, this often did little to deter a determined press gang. Life as a deserter was a precarious existence. You'd constantly look over your shoulder, always on guard, knowing that any stranger could be an informant. Finding legitimate work would be difficult without references, and you'd likely be forced into low-paying, informal labor, always with the fear of discovery. You might rely on the kindness of strangers or on underground networks that sometimes helped runaway sailors. Every creak of a floorboard, every knock at a door, could be the end of your short-lived freedom. The Royal Navy, for its part, employed various methods to track down deserters, from offering rewards to publishing detailed descriptions in newspapers. The constant need for men meant they rarely gave up the chase easily. So, Even if you managed to slip away from the ship and make it ashore, the shadow of impressment would follow you, a grim reminder that your body, your labor, was still considered property of the crown. It's a chilling thought that even after escaping the physical confines of the ship, your freedom remained conditional, a fleeting luxury that could be snatched away at any moment, plunging you back into the brutal reality of naval service. Beyond the immediate grind of daily life and the visceral terror of battle, your existence within the Royal Navy was inextricably linked to a much larger game: the machinations of politics and legacy. You, a single, often unwilling participant, were a tiny cog in the vast engine of British power, an instrument of empire. While you might not have understood the grand strategies, your presence was essential to projecting Britain's influence across the globe. Lord Nelson's Royal Navy wasn't just a collection of warships. It was the backbone of Britain's rise as a global superpower. Naval supremacy allowed Britain to control trade routes, protect its vast colonial empire, and project military might far beyond its shores. Every engagement, every blockade, every captured prize contributed to this larger geopolitical chess match. For you, this meant endless patrols in distant waters, long periods of mind-numbing boredom interspersed with moments of extreme terror. You might find yourself off the coast of Spain, or protecting convoys in the Caribbean, or enforcing blockades in the English Channel, all without truly understanding the intricate political dances that dictated your movements. Historians still argue whether Nelson's aggressive pursuit of French fleets was purely strategic genius or also influenced by a desire for personal glory and the substantial prize money that came with successful engagements. The ship itself was a floating symbol of British power. Its very presence in a foreign port could send a clear message, whether of friendship or veiled threat. The sheer scale of these vessels, their disciplined crews, and their formidable firepower were undeniable demonstrations of Britain's maritime dominance. You, standing on its decks, were part of that statement. While your personal experience was one of hardship and coercion, collectively, you represented the might that allowed Britain to maintain its vast trading networks and protect its interests against formidable rivals like France and Spain. One quirky tidbit: the stern of many Royal Navy ships, particularly the larger ones, would be elaborately carved and painted, often featuring classical figures or allegorical scenes. These weren't just decorative. They were designed to impress, to project an image of power and sophistication to any nation that saw them. Imagine polishing brass on a figurehead depicting Britannia, completely unaware of the political messages your work was helping to convey. The legacy of this era, and your forced participation in it, extends far beyond the immediate conflicts. The Royal Navy established a tradition of naval professionalism and discipline that would endure for centuries. The systems, the hierarchy, and even some of the customs born in this period would influence navies around the world. The battles fought and won, and sometimes lost, secured Britain's position as a dominant naval power for generations, shaping the geopolitical landscape for over a century. Your daily struggles, the sacrifices of thousands of men like you, laid the groundwork for this enduring legacy, even if you were just trying to survive another day. You were part of a time of immense technological and tactical innovation in naval warfare. From improvements in ship design to the refinement of gunnery techniques, the Royal Navy was constantly evolving, driven by the crucible of war. The lessons learned, often at great human cost, led to safer ships, more effective weaponry, and more sophisticated tactics. You might have seen these changes implemented firsthand, perhaps with new types of cannon or different rigging setups, always with the underlying purpose of making the fighting machine more lethal. The sheer, unwavering commitment to maintaining a superior fleet, regardless of the human cost, cemented Britain's place in global history. Your story, though one of individual hardship, is woven into this grand tapestry of national ambition and enduring power. So you've endured the press gang's brutality, the constant labor, the grim diet, and the pervasive threat of disease. You've faced down the terrifying chaos of naval battle, witnessed unspeakable horrors, and perhaps even tasted the fleeting illusion of freedom ashore. The question that lingers, then, after this journey through the unvarnished reality of Lord Nelson's Royal Navy, is a simple, yet profound one. Did you really make it? Could you have survived? The sobering truth is, for the vast majority of common seamen in that era, the odds were stacked heavily against you. Life expectancy aboard a warship was shockingly low. Disease, as we explored, was a far deadlier enemy than any cannonball. Typhus, dysentery, and especially scurvy silently ravaged crews, claiming lives by the hundreds on long voyages. Even if you escaped the more dramatic forms of death, the constant damp, the poor nutrition, and the sheer physical exhaustion would grind down your body, making you susceptible to countless ailments. It wasn't a quick death, often but a slow, debilitating decline. Historians still argue whether the cumulative toll of disease and accidents overshadowed the direct casualties of battle in overall mortality figures for the Royal Navy. It's a grim debate, but for you, the individual, the result was the same. Then there's battle. While the roar of the cannons might have been intermittent when it came, it was utterly devastating. The risk of being dismembered by cannonball, torn apart by splinters, or cut down in a boarding action was terrifyingly real. Even if you survived the initial engagement, grievous wounds often led to agonizing deaths in the cockpit, or lifelong disability that would leave you destitute in a society with little social safety net. Imagine losing an arm or a leg, only to be discharged with nowhere to go and no means of support. It was a bleak outlook for many. One quirky tidbit that speaks to the sheer danger. When a ship's cook would be preparing meals, especially in rough seas or during battle, he might tie himself to a stove with a rope to avoid being flung across the galley, a small but vital adaptation for survival in a constant state of peril. And even if you somehow avoided disease and battle, the sheer grind of daily life was a killer. The constant exertion, the lack of sleep, the poor hygiene, and the relentless discipline would wear down even the strongest constitution. Accidents were frequent, falling from the rigging, being crushed by shifting cargo, or slipping on a wet deck. A moment of carelessness, a frayed rope, or an unexpected wave could easily spell your end. The sea itself, as you learned, was an unforgiving environment, always ready to reclaim those who dared to challenge it. So, when you reflect on this journey, the answer to could you really survive is, in most cases, probably not. Survival wasn't just about being strong or brave. It was about an almost impossible combination of luck, resilience, and avoiding the myriad pitfalls that surrounded you. It was about escaping the impressment gang, enduring the brutal discipline, surviving disease outbreaks, emerging from battle unscathed, and then, somehow, navigating the treacherous waters of life ashore without being swallowed by poverty or dragged back to sea. For every celebrated admiral, for every heroic tale, there were thousands upon thousands of anonymous sailors who simply vanished into the statistical grimness of the age. Their stories are not often told, but they are the true reality of life in Lord Nelson's Royal Navy. Now, as the echoes of the cannons fade and the imagined scent of tar and salt slowly dissipates, let your mind drift away from the creaking timbers and the roaring waves. The ship, with its grim realities, is sailing into the distance, becoming a faint, murmuring memory. Feel the softness of your own bed, the warmth of your covers, and the comforting stillness of your room. The sounds of a bygone era are gently receding, replaced by the quiet hum of your own space, a safe harbor after our journey. There's no need for vigilance here, no demanding bosun's mate, no crashing waves to keep you awake. Just the calm, steady rhythm of your own breathing, easing you deeper into relaxation. Let the details of hardtack and grog dissolve into the quiet of the night. The stories are done, the history's settled. Just gentle rest, allowing your thoughts to drift like a calm tide, carrying you towards a peaceful sleep. You're safe now, truly safe.